The winter air in New York City had a biting edge that afternoon, the kind that made people wrap their scarves tighter and quicken their steps. Outside Trump Tower, the streets were alive with the usual hustle and bustle. Business people rushing to meetings, tourists snapping photos, and vendors calling out for customers. Among the noise and movement, one figure sat silently on the cold concrete, his presence easily overlooked by the busy crowd. Donald Trump had just finished a high-profile meeting and was flanked by a security detail as he exited the building. He adjusted his red tie against the gust of wind and waved briefly to the small group of supporters gathered near the entrance. His focus was already on the next item on his packed schedule when something caught his eye. A man sitting on the sidewalk, slumped over with a cardboard sign in his lap. The man looked to be in his early 40s, but his haggard appearance and weathered face made him seem older. He wore a patched-up coat that barely looked warm enough for the freezing weather, and his hands trembled as they clutched a sign that read, "Serve my country, but it forgot me. Need help to survive." A prosthetic leg jutted out awkwardly from beneath his jeans, and a battered military backpack lay beside him. Trump's stride faltered. Normally, he might not have stopped. His schedule was always too tight, his time too valuable. But something about the man drew his attention. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in the way he sat despite his circumstances. Or maybe it was the stark contrast between the man's condition and the opulence of the city around him. A reminder of lives often hidden in plain sight. "Hold on a second," Trump said, raising a hand to halt his security team. His lead agent, visibly confused, glanced around. "Is there a problem, sir?" Trump didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the man, ignoring the murmurs from passers-by who were now beginning to notice the scene. The man looked up as Trump approached, his tired brown eyes meeting the former president's. There was no recognition in his gaze, only the guarded wariness of someone who had been ignored, judged, or pitted too many times. "What's your name?" Trump asked, his tone brisk but not unkind. The man hesitated, as if unsure whether to answer. "Daniel," he said finally. His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in hours. "Daniel?" Trump crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to eye level. "What's your story?" Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Served in Afghanistan. Lost my leg in an IED blast. Came home, and things fell apart." He gestured vaguely to his prosthetic. "Now I'm here." The simplicity of his words carried the weight of years of struggle. Trump's gaze flicked to the prosthetic leg, then back to Daniel's face. "No family? No support? Family doesn't want anything to do with me," Daniel replied, his voice hardening. "I guess being a broken veteran wasn't part of their plans." Trump nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He glanced at the man's sign again, then at the thin jacket he wore. "You been out here long?" "Long enough," Daniel said with a bitter chuckle. "Long enough to know people don't stop for guys like me." "Well, I'm stopping," Trump said firmly, straightening up, "and we're going to do something about this." Daniel blinked, clearly taken aback. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see," Trump said, already motioning to one of his security agents. "Get this man inside the tower. He needs a hot meal and some warmth." Nearby onlookers had begun to gather, their phones raised to capture the unexpected interaction. The sight of Donald Trump, known for his larger-than-life persona, kneeling to speak with a homeless veteran was already causing a stir. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Is this real?" someone whispered. "What's he doing?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably as two of Trump's security agents helped him to his feet. "I don't need charity," he said stubbornly, his pride surfacing despite his circumstances. "This isn't charity," Trump replied. "Think of it as business. You tell me your story, and I'll listen." Daniel hesitated, searching Trump's face for signs of mockery or ulterior motives. Instead, he found an unexpected sincerity. With a resigned nod, he allowed the agents to guide him toward the entrance of Trump Tower. Inside the luxurious lobby, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, and polished marble floors reflected the grandeur of the space. Daniel looked out of place, his worn-out clothing and battered belongings standing in sharp relief against the opulence around him. He glanced around nervously, his shoulders tense. A staff member approached, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Trump waved him off. "Get us a table in the restaurant," he instructed, "and make sure it's private." As they walked toward the restaurant, Daniel leaned toward Trump. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. Trump paused, his expression thoughtful. "Because I can," he said simply. "And because I should." The reply left Daniel momentarily speechless. It was the first time in years anyone had shown him genuine concern without expecting something in return. At the restaurant, Daniel was served a hot meal, steak, mashed potatoes, and vegetables, and a steaming cup of coffee. He ate slowly at first, his hands trembling as he gripped the fork. Trump watched in silence, allowing the man to eat before continuing their conversation. As Daniel finished his meal, Trump leaned forward. "Now, tell me more about you. I want to know everything." And with that, the encounter that had started on a freezing street corner began to evolve into something much larger than either man could have anticipated. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped Daniel, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold he had endured for weeks. He hesitated at first, unsure if he should even be there, but the smell of food and the kindness he hadn't expected gave him enough courage to stay. Trump sat across from him, his expression a mixture of curiosity and determination. Daniel's plate was nearly empty now, the steak and potatoes having disappeared faster than he intended. He sipped the last of the coffee, letting the warmth settle into his chest. Trump leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Now," Trump began, breaking the silence, "tell me how you got here." "Start at the beginning?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking to the window. The city lights outside seemed like a world away from his reality. He didn't like talking about his past. It felt like picking at a scab that never healed. But Trump's tone was firm, not demanding but insistent, as if he wouldn't take no for an answer. "It's a long story," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "I've got time," Trump replied, gesturing for Daniel to go on. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. "All right, I joined the Marines when I was 19. Small-town kid, no money, no future. Military was my way out. My old man served in Vietnam. Thought I'd follow in his footsteps." Trump nodded. "Patriotism. I like that." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "It wasn't about patriotism. Not at first, anyway. It was about survival. Life back home wasn't exactly easy. My dad, he wasn't the same after Vietnam. Drink a lot, got angry a lot. My mom, well, she did her best, but we barely made ends meet." Trump listened intently, his face unusually serious. "Boot camp was rough, but I got through it. Made some good friends, brothers, really. We were deployed to Afghanistan in '08. It was hell out there, but we did our job. Thought we were making a difference, you know?" Daniel paused, his eyes distant. Trump didn't interrupt, giving him the space to continue. Then came the day that changed everything. We were on patrol in Kandahar. Routine stuff, nothing unusual. Then, boom, IED. It was like the whole world exploded. Daniel's voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "I woke up in a hospital bed with half my squad gone. My leg was gone too." Trump's brows furrowed. "I'm sorry. That's unimaginable." Daniel shrugged. "It's the price of war, right? At least, that's what they tell you. But the real battle started when I came home." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Trump leaned back slightly, digesting what he'd just heard. "Coming back was harder than I thought it'd be," Daniel continued. "People say they respect veterans, but that respect doesn't mean a damn thing when you can't find a job or pay your bills. The VA, well, let's just say they didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Months of waiting for appointments, piles of paperwork. Meanwhile, I was losing everything. My apartment, my savings, my wife." Trump's eyes widened slightly. "You were married?" Daniel nodded, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Her name was Angela. She stuck by me through the first year after I got back. But I wasn't the same guy she married. The nightmares, the drinking, I pushed her away without even realizing it. She tried, though. God, she tried. But in the end, she couldn't take it anymore." He fell silent for a moment, staring at his empty coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he hadn't asked. "She left, and I don't blame her," he said quietly. "After that, things went downhill fast. I was in and out of shelters, sleeping in my car until it got towed. Sold whatever I had left just to eat. Then Well, here I am. Trump rubbed his chin, his mind racing. No family to help you? No friends? Daniel shook his head. My dad passed away while I was overseas. Mom moved to Florida to live with my sister, and we haven't talked in years. As for friends, most of them didn't make it back. The ones who did are fighting their own battles. Trump's gaze softened. And the government? Nothing. Daniel's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. They gave me a medal and a prosthetic. That's about it. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for what I have, but it's not enough to live on. The system's broken, Mr. Trump. Guys like me, we fall through the cracks. Trump leaned forward, his voice quieter now. Do you want to get out of this? Get your life back? Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening. Of course I do, but it's not that simple. People look at me and see a cripple, a burden. I can't even get a job flipping burgers because the minute they see this, he tapped his prosthetic leg, they find a reason to say no. Trump frowned, his mind already churning with ideas. That's not acceptable. You fought for this country. You deserve better. Daniel met his gaze, his expression skeptical. Words are cheap, Mr. Trump. I've heard plenty of them. Trump straightened, his voice firm. Then I'll show you. We're gonna fix this, Daniel. Not just for you, but for every veteran who's been left behind. Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. He'd heard promises before, but there was something in Trump's tone that made him pause. Maybe it was the conviction, the sense that this wasn't just talk. Trump stood, signaling his security team. Come on, you're staying here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest. Daniel hesitated, still processing everything. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Trump paused, meeting his gaze. Because I can. And because someone has to. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost. Hope. The next morning, Daniel woke up in a soft bed for the first time in months. The warm light streaming through the hotel window felt unfamiliar, almost intrusive. For a brief moment, he didn't remember where he was or how he got there. Then it all came rushing back. Trump, the conversation, the meal, and the promise of something more. He sat up, rubbing his face as he tried to make sense of what had happened. Downstairs, Trump was already in motion. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls, messages, and emails, but his mind was fixed on one thing: the plan he had begun forming the night before. He had heard stories like Daniel's before, but meeting him in person, seeing the scars of war etched into his face and body, had struck a chord. Trump knew he had the resources to make a difference, and for once, he felt compelled to act. By the time Daniel made his way downstairs, limping slightly on his prosthetic leg, Trump was waiting for him. Dressed sharply in a suit, Trump looked as if he had been up for hours. He gestured for Daniel to join him at a table in the lobby restaurant, where a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of pastries awaited. You sleep all right? Trump asked, studying Daniel's face. Better than I have in years, Daniel admitted, though his voice carried a cautious tone. Not sure I'm used to all this yet. You will be, Trump said with a faint smile. But we're not done. This was just the beginning. Daniel furrowed his brow, unsure of what Trump meant. What do you mean by that? You've been through hell, Trump said, leaning forward. And that's unacceptable. You're not the only one, Daniel. There are thousands, maybe millions of veterans out there just like you, men and women who gave everything for this country and got nothing in return. That's going to change. Daniel stared at him, his skepticism evident. And how do you plan to do that? Simple, Trump replied, his voice confident. We're going to make noise. We're going to start something big, something no one can ignore. But first, I need you to help me. Help you? Daniel asked, his tone guarded. How? Trump motioned to one of his aides, who quickly approached with a folder. Inside were documents, statistics, and proposals, some rough, some more detailed. Trump slid the folder across the table to Daniel. You've lived it, Trump said. You know what's broken and what needs fixing. I need your perspective. You tell me what's wrong, and we'll figure out how to fix it. Daniel hesitated, flipping through the pages. The folder was filled with information about veteran homelessness, mental health programs, and employment initiatives, things he had tried to access but failed. It was overwhelming, but the sincerity in Trump's eyes made him pause. You're serious about this? Daniel asked, his voice soft. Dead serious, Trump said. This isn't about politics or publicity. It's about doing the right thing. Daniel nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his mind. All right, I'll help you, but I'm not a politician or a businessman. I'm just a guy who's been through the ringer. And that's exactly why I need you, Trump said. You're the real deal. People will listen to you. The rest of the morning was spent in deep discussion. Daniel shared his experiences, pointing out the flaws in the systems he had encountered. Trump listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking follow-up questions. He wasn't just listening, he was learning. By noon, Trump had already begun making calls. He reached out to contacts in government, nonprofits, and the private sector, pitching his idea for a comprehensive veterans initiative. Some were skeptical, others intrigued, but Trump's determination was undeniable. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself swept into a whirlwind of activity. Trump arranged meetings with veteran organizations, healthcare providers, and even a few lawmakers. At first, Daniel felt out of place among the polished professionals and powerful figures, but Trump made sure his voice was heard. "This is Daniel," Trump would say, introducing him at every meeting. "He's the reason we're doing this. Listen to him, because he knows better than any of us what's really going on." Daniel spoke hesitantly at first, his words halting and uncertain. But as he saw the genuine interest in the room, he began to open up. He shared his story, not just of his service, but of the battles he faced after coming home. He spoke of the nights he spent sleeping on benches, the frustration of being turned away from job interviews, and the hopelessness that threatened to consume him. His words were raw and unfiltered, and they struck a chord with everyone who heard them. Meanwhile, Trump worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He reached out to his network of business leaders, convincing them to invest in veteran employment programs. He arranged for one of his properties to be converted into temporary housing for homeless veterans, with plans to expand the model nationwide. He even set up a fund to cover medical expenses for veterans waiting on VA benefits. The media quickly caught wind of the initiative, and Trump's efforts became a headline story. Some praised him for his commitment, while others accused him of using the cause for personal gain. Trump brushed off the criticism, focusing instead on the work at hand. For Daniel, the experience was transformative. He went from feeling invisible to being at the center of a movement. People listened to him, respected him, and treated him like a person again. It was overwhelming at times, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. One evening, as the two men reviewed their progress, Daniel turned to Trump. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Trump looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "And because I can?" Daniel nodded, his skepticism finally starting to fade. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. The initial days of the initiative were a whirlwind of activity and promise. Daniel found himself thrust into a world he barely understood, navigating meetings, speaking engagements, and media appearances. Trump, true to his word, was relentless, using his influence to bring attention to veterans' issues and rally support. It seemed as though they were unstoppable. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form, and the road ahead proved far more complicated than either man anticipated. The first major challenge came from within Daniel himself. For years, he had lived with the weight of trauma, both physical and emotional. Being thrust into the spotlight unearthed memories and feelings he had tried to bury. The pressure to speak about his experiences, to represent an entire community of struggling veterans, began to take its toll. At night, he lay awake in his hotel room, haunted by the faces of the friends he had lost, their voices echoing in his mind. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings, Daniel snapped. Trump had invited him to a private dinner with a group of influential donors, and while the meal had gone well, Daniel felt out of place, a prop in a world he didn't belong to. As soon as they returned to the hotel, he confronted Trump in the lobby. "I'm not some mascot for your cause," Daniel said, his voice low but laced with anger. "I'm a person, and this feels like a performance." Trump looked at him, surprised but not defensive. "A performance? What are you talking about? You're the reason we're doing this." "Am I?" Daniel shot back. "Because sometimes it feels like I'm just here to make you look good." The accusation stung, and for a moment, Trump was silent. Then, his expression hardened. You think I'm doing this for publicity? Do you have any idea how much I've put on the line for this? Daniel didn't back down. Maybe. Or maybe you're just trying to fix your image. The tension in the air was palpable, the room heavy with unspoken frustration. Finally, Trump exhaled, his voice softer but still firm. You're wrong, Daniel. But if that's how you feel, maybe we need to take a step back. Daniel turned and walked away, retreating to his room. As the door closed behind him, he felt a pang of regret, but also a deep exhaustion. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going. Meanwhile, external forces began to push back against the initiative. Politicians from both sides of the aisle started questioning Trump's motives. Some accused him of using the program as a distraction from his controversial past, while others criticized the lack of detailed policy frameworks. Media outlets ran stories dissecting every aspect of the initiative, with headlines ranging from Trump's Veterans Program, genuine or grandstanding, to homeless veteran or political pawn. The scrutiny was relentless, and it quickly became clear that not everyone in Trump's circle supported the cause. Several high-ranking advisors quietly expressed their concerns, urging him to scale back his efforts. It's a noble idea, one of them said during a private meeting, but it's pulling resources away from other priorities. You need to think about the bigger picture. The bigger picture? Trump snapped. This is the bigger picture. These people gave everything for this country, and we've abandoned them. I'm not scaling back anything, but the pushback didn't stop there. Funding became a major hurdle. While Trump had personally committed significant resources to the program, it wasn't enough to sustain the scale he envisioned. Corporate donors, wary of the political implications, hesitated to invest. Nonprofits, while supportive in principle, were cautious about aligning too closely with such a polarizing figure. Progress slowed, and frustrations mounted. For Daniel, the mounting pressure was compounded by his own struggles with PTSD. During one public event, he froze mid-speech, his mind flooded with memories of the battlefield. The crowd fell silent as he stumbled over his words, his hands shaking. Trump, noticing his distress, quickly stepped in to cover for him. But the incident left Daniel feeling humiliated and exposed. I'm not cut out for this, Daniel admitted later that night, sitting across from Trump in the hotel lounge. I'm just a broken vet trying to survive. I don't know how to do this. Any of this. Trump studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You're not broken, Daniel. You're human, and you're doing more than you realize." But Daniel wasn't convinced. The weight of the expectations placed on him felt unbearable, and the spotlight only intensified his insecurities. He began to withdraw, skipping meetings and avoiding public appearances. Trump, frustrated but understanding, gave him space, though it was clear the strain was affecting both of them. Then came the scandal. A tabloid ran a story accusing Trump of misusing funds from the initiative, claiming that a portion of the donations had been redirected to his businesses. The article cited anonymous sources and incomplete financial records, but the damage was immediate. Social media erupted with outrage, and critics seized the opportunity to discredit the entire program. Daniel, already on edge, felt betrayed. When a reporter cornered him outside the hotel, asking for his thoughts on the allegations, he didn't hold back. "If that's true, then it just proves what I've been afraid of all along," he said, "that this is more about him than it is about us." The comment went viral within hours, fueling the backlash. Trump, blindsided by the scandal and Daniel's remarks, called an emergency meeting with his team. "We need to get ahead of this," he said, pacing the room. "Release the financials, schedule a press conference, do whatever it takes to clear this up." Behind closed doors, Trump confronted Daniel. "You think I'm stealing from this initiative? After everything we've done together?" Daniel, his voice strained, replied, "I don't know what to think anymore. All I know is that this doesn't feel right." The tension between them reached its breaking point. For days, they barely spoke, each man consumed by his own frustrations and doubts. The initiative, once full of promise, now seemed on the verge of collapse. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of veterans who had benefited from the program came forward, sharing their stories with the media. One by one, they spoke of how the initiative had given them hope, housing, and jobs. Their testimonials began to shift the narrative, casting doubt on the allegations against Trump. Bolstered by the support, Trump held a press conference addressing the scandal heat-in. He presented detailed financial records, proving that every dollar had been used appropriately. He also took the opportunity to reaffirm his commitment to the cause. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice firm. "This is about men and women like Daniel. People who sacrificed everything for this country and deserve our respect, our support, and our action." Watching the press conference from his hotel room, Daniel felt a pang of guilt. He realized that despite their differences, Trump had stayed true to his word. He reached out that evening, apologizing for doubting him. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I let my own fears get in the way." Trump nodded, his expression softening. "We've both made mistakes, but this isn't over. We got work to do." And with that, they began to rebuild. Not just the initiative, but their trust in each other. The challenges had tested them, but they emerged stronger, ready to face whatever came next. The early victories of the initiative were like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm. Daniel and Trump watched as their efforts began to take shape, bringing tangible changes to the lives of veterans across the country. The housing project in New York City became a model for others, with similar developments planned in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Dallas. Veterans who had once been homeless now had roofs over their heads and access to on-site counseling, job training, and healthcare services. The media called it a revolution in veteran care, and public support swelled. One of the initiative's first major successes came in the form of a partnership with a national grocery chain. Trump had personally negotiated the deal, convincing the company to prioritize hiring veterans for managerial positions. Daniel had been present at the meeting, his quiet but compelling testimony about his struggles to find work after the war tipping the scales in their favor. Soon, hundreds of veterans were gainfully employed, and the success stories began pouring in. A Marine who had been living in his car was now a store manager. A former Army medic, unable to find work for years, was running a training program for new hires. Daniel found himself smiling more often, realizing that the initiative was more than just a program. It was a lifeline for people like him. Despite these triumphs, the challenges loomed large. Not every attempt to expand the initiative went smoothly. Resistance from local governments and communities was an unexpected hurdle. In one case, a planned housing development in a suburban neighborhood outside of Atlanta was met with fierce opposition from residents. At a heated town hall meeting, Daniel and Trump attended to defend the project. Residents voiced their concerns, with some claiming the development would lower property values and attract crime. One man stood up and said bluntly, "We respect what you've done for the country, but this isn't the place for you." Daniel clenched his fists under the table but kept his voice steady as he responded. "With all due respect, we didn't fight for just certain neighborhoods. We fought for all of them, and we're not asking for a handout. We're asking for a chance to rebuild our lives." The room fell silent, and though not everyone was convinced, the development ultimately moved forward. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. The constant pushback wore on Daniel, who often wondered if the fight was worth it. Meanwhile, the pressure on Trump intensified. His high-profile involvement in the initiative brought both praise and scrutiny. While many applauded his efforts, others accused him of using the cause to rehabilitate his image. Critics pointed to the media coverage and claimed that the initiative was more about optics than substance. The criticism hit a peak when an investigative journalist published a scathing article questioning the initiative's finances. The piece alleged that funds from corporate donors were being misused, with vague references to administrative costs that appeared to benefit Trump's businesses. The accusations were unsubstantiated, but the damage was immediate. News outlets ran with the story, and social media erupted with outrage. Daniel was blindsided by the scandal. He had trusted Trump's intentions, but now doubts crept in. One night, after a particularly grueling day of media inquiries, he confronted Trump in his office. "Is there any truth to this?" Daniel asked, his voice heavy with frustration. "Because if there is, I need to know." Trump, visibly annoyed but calm, leaned back in his chair. "None of it's true," he said firmly. "Every dollar has gone to the initiative. But you know how the media works. They'll twist anything to fit their narrative. Daniel studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded. Then we need to prove it. Publicly. If we don't, this whole thing will collapse. Trump agreed, and within days, they held a press conference to address the allegations. Detailed financial records were released, showing exactly where the money had gone. Trump spoke with uncharacteristic vulnerability, emphasizing his commitment to the cause and acknowledging the toll the accusations had taken. Helping our veterans isn't just a responsibility, he said. It's a privilege, and no amount of lies or criticism will stop us from doing what's right. The transparency paid off. Public opinion began to shift, and several prominent figures, including veteran advocacy groups, came forward to defend the initiative. The scandal, while damaging, ultimately strengthened their resolve. For Daniel, however, the experience left scars. The pressure of being in the public eye and the constant battles with skeptics and critics weighed heavily on him. One night, after returning to his hotel room, he stared at himself in the mirror, questioning if he was strong enough to keep going. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Trump, uncharacteristically casual in a sweater and slacks. He held 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. "You look like you need this," Trump said, setting the glasses down and pouring them each a drink. Daniel chuckled despite himself. "You're not wrong." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared struggles filling the room. "You ever think about giving up?" Daniel asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "All the time," Trump admitted, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "But then I remember why I started. And more importantly, who I'm doing this for." Daniel nodded, his gaze distant. "It's hard, seeing the resistance, the accusations, the people who don't want us to succeed. Hard doesn't mean impossible," Trump said. "You've faced worse than this, Daniel. And you came out the other side." Daniel looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "I guess I did." The moment reminded Daniel of why he had joined the fight in the first place. It wasn't for himself. It was for the countless others who couldn't fight for themselves. The triumphs they had achieved so far, while hard-won, were proof that their efforts mattered. In the months that followed, the initiative overcame its setbacks and continued to grow. More housing developments opened, more veterans found jobs, and more lives were changed. Daniel and Trump worked tirelessly, their partnership evolving into a genuine friendship. One day, as they stood together at the opening of a new veteran center in Chicago, Daniel turned to Trump. "You think we'll ever be done with this?" he asked. Trump smirked. "Not a chance. There's always more work to do." Daniel laughed, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a belief that no matter how hard the fight, it was worth it. The weeks that followed the revelation of Daniel's connection to Trump's niece were transformative for both men. Their shared history had solidified a bond that went beyond their roles in the initiative, driving them to work harder than ever. But the path to success was not without its obstacles, and the final push would demand every ounce of their resolve. With the scandal behind them and public opinion beginning to shift, Trump and Daniel focused on expanding the initiative. Trump secured additional funding from private donors, leveraging his influence to bring major corporations on board. Housing projects for homeless veterans sprang up in multiple cities, and partnerships with mental health organizations provided counseling and therapy for those struggling with PTSD. Daniel, though hesitant at first, became the face of the movement, traveling across the country to speak at events and share his story. During one such event, held in a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C., Daniel stood on stage, his prosthetic leg barely visible beneath his tailored pants. The audience was a mix of veterans, advocates, and politicians, all eager to hear from the man who had inspired a national conversation about the treatment of those who served. "I'm not a hero," Daniel began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I'm just a man who did his duty and paid the price. But for years, I felt like that price wasn't enough to earn me a place in the world I fought for. I felt invisible, forgotten." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I'm not invisible anymore. And neither are the thousands of veterans who have been through what I've been through. We're here, we're alive, and we deserve better." The crowd erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Trump, sitting in the front row, watched with a rare expression of pride. He knew how much it had taken for Daniel to stand there, to confront his past and use it as a force for change. After the event, Daniel and Trump met backstage. "You were incredible out there," Trump said, clapping him on the shoulder. Daniel smiled, a faint hint of the man he had been before the war. "I never thought I'd be doing this, but it feels right." "It is right," Trump said, "and we're just getting started." The initiative continued to grow, gaining bipartisan support in Congress for legislation aimed at improving veterans' benefits and access to health care. Trump personally lobbied lawmakers, using his unique mix of charm and persistence to sway even his fiercest critics. Daniel, meanwhile, worked on the ground, connecting with veterans groups and ensuring their voices were heard in the decision-making process. One of the most significant milestones came when the first veteran housing project was completed. Located in New York City, the complex provided not only apartments but also on-site counseling, job training, and community support. At the grand opening ceremony, Trump and Daniel stood side by side, cutting the ribbon as a crowd of reporters and veterans cheered. As they toured the facility, Daniel was approached by a young man in his 20s, a fellow veteran who had been one of the first residents. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, his voice trembling. "I don't know where I'd be without this place." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll make the most of it." The moment reinforced the importance of their work. It wasn't just about policy changes or public appearances. It was about the real, tangible impact on people's lives. Despite their successes, the initiative faced its share of setbacks. Not every city welcomed the housing projects, and some communities resisted the idea of veterans moving into their neighborhoods. There were heated town hall meetings, protests, and even legal battles. But Trump and Daniel refused to back down, fighting every challenge with unwavering determination. Through it all, Daniel found himself growing stronger. The work gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and the connections he formed with other veterans reminded him that he wasn't alone. He began to see his prosthetic leg not as a symbol of loss, but as a testament to his resilience. For Trump, the initiative marked a turning point in his legacy. While he had always been a polarizing figure, his commitment to the cause earned him respect from unexpected corners. Even some of his harshest critics admitted that his efforts were making a real difference. The culmination of their work came at a national summit on veterans issues, held 1 year after the initiative's launch. Leaders from across the country gathered to discuss the progress that had been made and the challenges that still lay ahead. Daniel was the keynote speaker, his speech broadcast live to millions of viewers. As he stood at the podium, he glanced at Trump, who was seated in the audience. Their eyes met, and Daniel felt a surge of gratitude. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to think that my story didn't matter," he said, "that I was just one of many struggling in silence. But this past year has shown me that every story matters. Every veteran matters. And when we come together, when we listen, when we act, we can change lives." The speech was met with thunderous applause, and as Daniel stepped off the stage, Trump was the first to greet him. "You've come a long way, my friend," Trump said, shaking his hand. "So have you," Daniel replied with a grin. The summit ended with the announcement of new federal funding for veterans programs, a testament to the power of their efforts. As the event concluded, Trump and Daniel stood outside, watching the crowd disperse. "What's next?" Daniel asked, his tone lighter than it had been in months. Trump smirked. "Next? We keep going. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning." Daniel nodded, a sense of hope settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like his future was brighter than his past. In the months that followed, the initiative continued to grow, touching the lives of countless veterans and inspiring a nationwide movement. Trump's legacy, once defined by controversy, was now intertwined with a cause that had brought hope and change to so many. And Daniel, the man who had once been invisible, had found his voice and his place in the world. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was proof that even the most unlikely partnerships could make a difference. Together, they had turned pain into purpose and built a legacy that would endure for generations.